Okay, now it's a true honor and pleasure for us to introduce the first keynote speaker, Jim Jagielski, a man that Jim doesn't really need an introduction, at least not to the open source community. He is one of the strongest drivers for open source. He's a co-founder of Apache Foundation. He's working with Red Hat. He's on numerous boards, and we are truly delighted to announce that as of yesterday, he's also a member of the MARSEC-XL Council.
So with such strong growth board, we're quite confident that the boat is going to speed up.
Yes, very well. Thank you. These working? No, one good. Okay. I can take these. It's actually quite late in the presentation, so if we could move it closer to the front. Now, if you're really smart, you're watching all of these as I'm going backwards, and you're going to have all these great questions for me. Okay, great. So, good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? I'll try to use this. I tend to walk around a bit when I talk, so I might phase in and phase out a little bit. We talked a little bit about open source. When you heard Veer use the term open source, so what exactly does that mean? What exactly is open source, and why should you care about it? Why is it important to not only IT, but also MARSEC and everything else as well? A little bit about myself. As Veer said, I still consider myself a developer, a hacker. Because of that, I've also been involved with a number of different foundations. The Apache Software Foundation was probably best known for the Apache web server and things like that. I'm also on a number of other boards, the Open Source Initiative, which we'll talk about a little later on, and the IOOI Foundation, to pay the bills, because none of those jobs or anything actually is a salary. I work for a company called Red Hat, which is an open source based company, so if you need open source consulting or operating systems and stuff like that, be sure to take a look at them. And as Veer said, I'm also a council member of MARSEC-XL. Okay, so what is open source? Okay, basically when you try to boil it down, there are a couple common factors about open source. First of all, there's the idea of open source licensing, which determines, which is the contract between the people who develop the code and the people who they want to use the code or distribute the code. There's also the whole idea about free software. And actually in the next slide I'll talk a little bit about what is the difference, if anything, between free software and open source. In the EU, for example, the term is much more used, free software. In the US and other areas, it's called open source. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the open source governance models, communities. How do you build communities around open source projects? And why are the methods of building communities so important to what makes open source itself very important? Now, as I mentioned before, it's also called free software, the idea, but the word free has a really confusing connotation. Sometimes when you think of the word free, you think of no cost, as in free beer, okay? The real idea about free software is free as in free speech. That is something you're able to share with people. Now, you may have to buy or purchase free software, but the idea behind it is that there are freedoms associated with that software. You're free to use the software, you're free to update the software, and things like that. Now, sometimes people see in certain aspects or audiences of open source and free software that there's some almost philosophical debates about what the difference is between free software and open source software. And I would just advise you just ignore that. Think of them as pretty much two sides of the same coin, the same thing. So the basic ideas, the basic core fundamentals of what open source and free software is basically you get access to the source code. Now, why is that important? Well, think of it if you had a car. And when you purchased the car, the hood of the car was welded shut. So if you needed to fix the car, if you needed to do maintenance on the car, if you wanted to add features to the car, you would be unable to do so. Because the manufacturer of that car has locked you out of doing anything at all to update that. Okay, with free software and open source software, basically the hood of the software is available and open to you. So you can update the software to do what you want to do. If you're a company, you get to use the software in a way you want to be able to and update it to be better suited to what your business needs are. You don't need to rely on what someone thinks the software should do. You get to decide what that software can do for you. So that's one of the basic main reasons why access to the source code is very, very important in open source. Also, you have the ability to use it for any reason whatsoever. So if you just want to be an end user using OpenOffice or LibreOffice as a substitute for Microsoft Office, you're perfectly willing and able to do that. But if you're also a company who decides, you know what would be great is to have a form of OpenOffice available on my Joy tablet or on my iPhone, well, I can take that software and develop it differently, put a different skin on it, and now have this working on different platforms that maybe the OpenOffice or the LibreOffice people didn't think about that. So you're able to use that in other ways, both personally as well as from a business standpoint. And of course, in addition to that, it implies the ability to modify the code and then share that code with other people. That you're able to make that modification and allow others to take advantage of whatever additions you made on there. So in a lot of ways, especially from the IT world, it's sort of like a new way to develop software. We're so used to the old commercial proprietary ways of developing software where you had no idea how the program worked. You saw what it did, but how did it do it? You had no ideas. This is a new way of developing software, licensing the software, and distributing the code to other people, so people could use it as well. Now, the idea behind open source and free software is actually kind of old. As was mentioned earlier, the internet itself was based on open source. If you send an email, you're using open source. If you go to a website, you're using open source. If you're using your Droid phone, you're using open source. Open source is key to a lot of the technology that we see nowadays. In fact, it'd be almost impossible to find any significant part of IT and communication and telecommunications that doesn't use and leverage open source nowadays, okay? And so as I mentioned before, the key technologies of the web and the cloud are built on open source. Now, in a lot of ways, that isn't a unique idea because it's really keyed on the whole scientific method, the whole standing on the shoulders of giants. You know, the whole idea of science is that someone develops something, shares it with others, and allows other people to confirm it, check it out, verify results, and add on top of it. And so we're just using that method inside of IT. Now, why would people want to worry about this? You know, if you're a developer, a hacker, why is open source important to you? Now, for me, I consider developers and software designers as artists. And in general, artists want to show their talents. You know, painters want to do their paintings and then display them for other people. And I think the parallel is very, very key here with developers. So you're really having a real impact on IT development. You're able to say, I wrote this. That, you know, in some way I helped develop the internet, or I helped run the internet, because something I did was able to do that. What's also very, very important is you get the key sense of a membership in a community. And I can't stress that enough, is that for open source to be successful, you need to have a community built around the open source project that you're working about. And again, that is very, very important. People have this idea, this misconception of developers as lonely, solitary people stuck in their basements developing code in the dark. And that's really not the case. The developers enjoy being part of the community, and open source allows you to be a member of that community. Another thing is that really, if you're an engineer, if you're a developer, you love to tinker. You love to fool around with stuff. Same way if you're a mechanic with a car, you never want to leave it alone. You always want to work on it. If you're a sailor, you're always improving the boat. You're always doing everything you can. And having open source enables you to do that because you have access to the key bits that develop the software. Now, for companies, obviously they're driven towards open source for a different reason. Okay, they help also to drive the development and the future and the goals of IT, because basically open source is what drives IT in general. Okay, you also have a sense of a membership in the community as well, although not as tightly tied as it is with the developer. But the most, obviously, when you're a company, at the end of the day, you're worried about revenue. So what is it about open source and open source technology that makes it easier for you as a company to use and leverage open source? Well, first of all, you save a lot on expensive resources. I mean, let's look at it. If you are a navigation company, you're developing GPS systems, for example, okay, you look at the software that drives those devices, 80, 85, maybe even 90% of the code that drives the devices are the exact same. So each company is wasting valuable time, valuable resources, valuable talent, recreating the wheel because that's my code and I'm not sharing with anyone else. So you're wasting a lot of time, you're wasting a lot of resources inside there, okay? By having a common foundation, a common core set of code that people can share, that means that you're able to then refocus that talent on the things that make your company, your devices, your services key, unique, and different. So that really enables you as a company to differentiate yourself based on the good stuff and not having to worry about the normal day-to-day aspects of the software out there. Okay. It also means that if you have this increased flexibility, that as a company you're very, very quick and able and nimble to take up with changes that happen in the environment. If, for example, people need a new feature or an enhancement on something, you're able to very, very quickly make that change because open source allows you to leverage those resources inside there, okay? At the end result, it means increased market share for a company and increased revenue by leveraging the power of open source. And now, of course, if you're a user, some of this might be, obvious to people. But obviously, you get access to the source code if you want to. Now, if you're a typical end user, you don't need to worry about that. What's really important to you is that, in general, you don't have to pay huge licensing fees. For example, you can download LibreOffice and OpenOffice for free instead of having to pay many euros for Microsoft Office. If you're also an end user, it means that you're not tied in to a particular vendor. If you want to decide to move from one software package to another, you can without having any pain involved in doing that. What's also very, very important is that with open source, it has this very, very tight loop between the user and the developer, because developers are users. And that means that the software is much more in tune to users, much more user-friendly, much more user-focused than you would see commercial and proprietary software. Now, unfortunately, there is still this idea of FUD, which stands for fear, uncertainty, and doubt around open source. You mention open source to some people in some companies, and they say, oh, I can't trust open source. It's not secure, there's no quality, it's scary, there's no way to make money out of it, and things like that. And that has been proven wrong time and time and time again. Open source is much more secure, of much higher quality, much more reliable and robust than commercial proprietary software easily. And the biggest misconception about it is that it doesn't drive innovation. And again, the easiest way to combat that is just look at the innovations behind open source in the internet, in social media. Open source allow these kind of quick turnarounds, fast innovation, by collaborating in community-based associations inside there. Now, how much time do I have? I don't have Great. If you are developing open source, what exactly do you mean by true open source? I talked a little bit about licensing earlier on, okay? So for software, for code to be open source or free, it needs to be under an open source license. There are two different families of licenses that must be okay. There's the open source initiative, open source definition, which defines some of the rules of the license. There's also the Free Software Foundation, which provides a set of accepted licenses, for example, out there. Now, new open source and free software licenses are very, very hard to get approved. If you are thinking about developing an open source project or an open source code base, my advice is to use a license which is already approved, okay? Now, in general, there are three main types or families of open source licenses out there, okay? Okay, the three main types are the give me credit kind of licenses, the give me fixes, and give me everything. And I'll go into much more detail about these, okay? First of all, we'll talk about the give me credit type of licenses, which are out there and available. Okay, these are very, very liberal, permissive licenses. They have very, very few restrictions on what you can actually do with the type of code once you get it. The Apache Software Foundation's license, the Apache license is one of these. It's very, very business friendly because what it allows is for a business to take the code, the software which is under an Apache license, and basically do anything they want to do with it. If they want to release their modifications for free, whereas open source, they certainly can. If you don't want to, if you want to create a commercial or proprietary version of that open source software, you can as well. Restrictions are not there. And so it really allows a much more reuse of the code. It's much more open and legally non-complex license for people to use out there. Now, if you're a community, it means that it really makes it difficult to have a single entity controlling that software project. Because the license itself allows the code to be used by as many different people as possible, with as few restrictions as possible, it's difficult for one entity to have much more control over the direction and the goal of the software project, because it enables a lot more people to be able to use it and things like that. Okay, and it is used in the largest different varieties of communities out there, as we'll see in a little bit. Finally, there are the give me fixes types of licenses out there. This is, for example, the lesser general public license, the Eclipse Mozilla licenses and stuff like that. These are licenses which say, here's the software that I am providing to you under this license, okay? You can do anything you want to do with it. If, however, you fix that actual software, if you add a feature to that software, or patch a bug in that software, you have to give that fix back to us. But anything else you do with that software is still yours. You don't need to also, share that code if you don't want to. And so in a lot of ways, it's very, very business friendly as well, because again, if you're a company, you can create your own commercial variant without worrying about giving away the stuff that makes you distinctive if you're using open source in your software packages out there. Okay, because it is somewhat restrictive, it does mean that if you're a company and you want to have focused control on the development of the software, you can. But what's really, really important about it is that it ensures that the software itself is always being improved. So any community effort that's being done on the software itself, on the code itself, the entire community always gets the benefit from that, which is a very, very key important point. And finally, there's the idea of the give me everything kind of licenses out there. Okay, and the best example of that is the general public license from the Free Software Foundation, okay, which basically says that this software is under this license, and if you create another work, if you use this software to develop or implement something else, then everything else that it touches also needs to be under the general public license. It also needs to be free software. It needs to be open source. So even the private bits that you put on top of it also need to be under this license, and also needs to be the software out there. It is in general somewhat more legally complex because all these things only happen when you're redistributing software. And a lot of people think, well, what exactly does that mean? If I'm a large company and if I'm developing the software in one division of my company, using it in a different one, is that distribution or not? Now, what you see in a lot of cases is that this enables, if you are the copyright holder of the actual software itself, it enables a business model called dual license. You saw this if people are familiar with MySQL, for example, the database. It meant that there was the community version, which was under GPL, but if you needed to use it in a business entity, if you wanted to build software around that, and you weren't willing or able or didn't want to open source everything else, they would sell you a commercial proprietary package about that. So it really enables that. Also, what's very, very important is that if you're a contributor to that code, you have that promise, that guarantee that that software will always be free. That promise and guarantee doesn't exist for the other types of licenses out there. So if you are very, very key into ensuring that software is always free, always open and available, then the GPL is definitely a license for you. As I mentioned before, the license differences are really only take effect when you're distributing the code and what's considered a derivative work. And those are legal questions that I can't answer for you, that you would need to worry about yourself. Okay. There is actually no idea of one true license. There are certainly people who are much more, who say that the GPL is better or the Apache license is better. It really is designed as a tool. You know, don't think that just because one license is more heavily used, that it's the better license. Basically it's contract, it's an agreement between you, the software developer, and the entity out there. Now there are some basic rules to follow in general. If you're trying to implement an open standard, an open reference implementation, for example, then having the software under an Apache type license is better, okay? If wide adoption is important to you, then again, maybe an Apache type license might be better as well. If you want to restrict any sort of non-shared enhancements, if you want to guarantee that the software is always freely available and open source, then you need to look at more of a copyleft kind of license out there. I want to talk a little bit about the whole idea about governance and community, because it is a key factor, a key issue inside of open source communities. And it basically is, how does the community itself operate? How do conflicts get resolved? How do you ensure collaboration between people? Okay. Okay, in general, again, if you want to try to distill it down into the three different types, there's sort of like the walled garden variety of community, and I'll explain more what these mean. The second type is what we call a benevolent dictator. And the third type is what we call the meritocratic community model, built on the concept of merit and peer review. Okay? So let's look at the walled garden, for example. The whole idea behind this is that, in general, it's designed as an open source project by license, but really controlled and directed by a single entity. So yeah, they will accept patches, for example. They will have the source code available to you in an open source license. But there really is no community around it. The community has very, very little say in the direction of what the software goes, what features are added, what patches and bugs are fixed, and things like that, okay? So the involvement in the actual code development itself is very, very closed. You know, the way I look at it, this is what I would consider a minimal open source project. The only thing that makes it, quote, open source is the license it's available to. But as far as fostering a collaboration between people, as being a neutral ground for other contributors and developers and companies and organizations to be involved in the open source project, it's very, very restricted. Because really, at the end of the day, any improvements in the software project mostly benefit the single entity that controls that open source project. In general, most of these open source projects are under a copyleft kind of license, a GPL type license. And again, it's to make sure that the involvement is very, very controlled and restricted out there. The other type is what we call the benevolent dictator for life concept. And this is something which is very, very popular, especially with languages and like that. In general, you don't see a particular single type of license for these kind of community models out there. Involvement in the code itself is much more open than the log model, but the key idea behind this kind of development model is that there is a single person, or maybe a small group of people, who have the ultimate authority and responsibility to resolve conflicts. If the community itself is unable to collaborate together and come up with some sort of consensus-based decision on whether a feature should be added, the direction of the software base, then this person has the ability to step in and say, I'll take care of it, I'll resolve the problem. I'll make the decision associated with that. The best example of that is Linux, of course, with Linus and his group of generals, in which really the community allows him to do that. And that's the other key idea behind the concept of a benevolent dictator for life, is that the person has not usurped power from the community. He hasn't declared himself in general the benevolent dictator for life. The community has given him that power, given him or her that power. So even though, it again emphasizes the idea that it still is a community around the code, there's a community around the project, but they have given some power to this person to be able to resolve conflicts and things of that nature. Okay, finally, there is the idea of merit, or meritocracy, which is the idea that everyone is equal. There is a single layer of peers inside of the community. No person has more say than another. No person's vote or opinion is more important than anything else. It's really designed to basically force consensus and collaboration inside the development of the community out there. Now, in general, most of the projects that are meritocratic in nature are under a permissive, give me credit kind of license, the Apache license, for example. Okay, and the involvement of the developers in this project are based on what they do. You don't become a developer on this because you happen to be employed by Red Hat or Google or Microsoft or whatever, or because oh, I know him, he's a great guy. You actually have to prove yourself. You have to show what talents you bring to the table, and by doing more work, by submitting more patches or more development to documentation and stuff like that, you're basically showing merit. You're showing the power and the ability to have a controlling say in the direction and the development of the codes that are out there. Okay. What's also very, very important is that going into the project, you see what you can become. That you know that, okay, I can, after a period of time and after a period of effort, actually have what's called commit privileges to the code. You actually physically touch and change the code that's going to be causing that the software is going to be based on. I actually get a say in the direction of the code and stuff like that. Something which may not exist in some of the other models out there. In general, as I said before, what's really, really key and crucial in these kind of governance models is that everyone is equal. So it really provides a perfect environment for software which companies are going to be using and leveraging. A really good example of that is just thinking of the different software packages which are being provided by the Apache Software Foundation. Things like the Apache Web Server, Tomcat, and Hadoop, and other software packages. These are projects which a wide variety of companies are building their business models on. Okay, and the reason why they feel comfortable doing that is they realize that no one person, no one company has undue influence. The community itself decides what the software does, not a company, not a business. And the people, when they're developing the code, are acting on what's best for the code itself. When I work on the software projects that I do, even though Red Hat pays my salary, I do what's best for the actual software project, not necessarily what's best for Red Hat. So I don't add a feature because Red Hat wants it. I add a feature because the community wants it, or because I want it. And these kind of bureaucratic processes, which are basically built direct collaboration, enforces that, ensures that, and makes it a safe way and a really good software project for companies to base their projects on. So in general, we have basically a few lessons learned from the Apache Software Foundation to help enforce and ensure this collaboration. First of all is the use of email lists. Now, email may seem very, very old school, especially when they're do wikis and IRC and things like that. But the problem is that if you're not in the right time zone, then you're disenfranchised. You don't feel part of the community because I'm 7 hours ahead or 7 hours behind. By using email lists, it means that everyone's on the same level, that it's immediately archived so you can figure out why stuff got added, why decisions were made. So all the development, all the communication, everything that involves the history and the heritage and the experience of that project are on email lists. It allows people to, if I want to find out and jump into a new software project, I can read the email archives. And after reading it, I know everything, well, theoretically, everything that people who've been there from the beginning know, because I have access to the history, to the heritage. The other thing is to drive consensus. Use what we, if you look at if anyone's on Google Plus, for example, you'll see that it's the +1, okay? That actually came from the Apache Software Foundation. That's how we gauge consensus inside of the ASF. Should we add this feature? Should we fix this bug? And you'll see on the email this is +1, which means yes. You might see a -1 that says, no, I don't want this feature or something like that. But again, it's really, really important. It's a shorthand way of having the entire community around this project have a say in the focus of the project, and the direction of the project out there. The other very, very important thing is to avoid poisonous people. This is especially important in communities which there are collaboration inside there, okay? A poisonous person is someone who, despite their talents, despite everything they provide to the project, force people away, make the project an unhealthy, poisonous, and unfun place to be. And in general, most of the people who work open source do so because they enjoy what they're doing. They enjoy working on the software. They're doing it, on their time away. They're volunteers. It should be fun. When poisonous people, when people in there who are very, very poisonous, antagonistic, mean-spirited people are on these projects, they force people away. And so, being aware of what poisonous people are and ensuring that they either change their ways or no longer parts of the community are very, very important. So definitely think about that. People may say, what, he's a real pain, but he's a great developer, he's a great coder, and so we should have to put up with him. But that really causes a lot of damage to the community, and it's something we avoid. So we talked about some of what open source is. Obviously, the Apache Web Server was probably the best known, success stories. By having a free, open implementation of, a web server out there, it really allowed the web to be successful. That there aren't different versions of the web, which was really, really a concern. back in the early days of the World Wide Web, that there would be sort of like the AOL, American Online version of the web, and the CompuServe version of the web. Now it's just the web, and everybody talks the same. And that was because there was a free implementation of a web server out there that would do that. Linux, has succeeded where other, operating systems hasn't. Okay, and think about it. I mean, Linux is everywhere. It's in your phone. It's in your toaster. Everywhere you can think of it. So it's the vast numbers of people who are using this open source system. And what we're seeing is that MARSEC-XL, the MARS itself, is going to be another success story that really sees the innovation that we're seeing in IT make the same sort of substantial change inside of the maritime industry, inside of e-navigation, inside of this reference implementation that allows these independent, self-contained pockets of maritime technology to finally communicate together for their benefit as well as the benefit of the end users. So some contributing thoughts is that if you are interested in open source, okay, there should be a business reason associated with it. Some people do say, oh, let's go open source because it's fun, or it's interesting, or it's cool, or it's neat. Don't do that. That's a stupid thing to do. Open source is something that you should think about as a business aspect, okay? Give thought to licensing very, very early because it's very, very difficult to change licensing later on, okay? As I said before, a lot of developers and users join it because they're drawn to it, so give them a reason to join the development asset. Trust your developers and your users. What's very, very important in open source is you do have this tight, I guess it's called a feedback loop between the user community and the developer community. One of the key aspects of this health of open source, okay? Just because something is open source doesn't mean it's great. There's a lot of really, really crappy open source out there, okay? So just because something is open source doesn't mean that you can instantly trust it, okay? Look at the heritage of it, look at the people behind it, read the email archives and things like that. Make it an interesting but informed choice about open source out there. And really, success is not measured by market share, measured by adoption of the open source projects themselves. So these are some helpful links right here. I am on Twitter, so if you want to follow me, I'm at jimjag.com. I don't know if we have time left for Q&A or not, but anyway, those are my slides. I will be here, obviously, all of today, tomorrow. So if you can't think of any questions right now, then I'll be here. So
open for questions, anyone? Any questions?
Are people awake?
I'm a little bit awake. I loved your classification of the licenses and as well the community types. And what was interesting was when you talked about the walled garden, you somewhat equated that with GPL, and then of course the most famous of that was Dictator Linus works on software that's licensed under the GPL.
Right.
So can you just sort of resolve that?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think that when you look at a walled garden kind of environment, what's important is that there needs to be a single entity that has pretty much full control over the direction of the software, which implies in a lot of ways copyright to the actual source code. So that way, yes, I can release it as GPL, but I can also, since I have copyright associated to it, at a certain point in time, take whatever it is I'm working on and make it totally proprietary. Okay? Yes, the code that I forked away from will always be GPL, but because I own copyright to that, even though that was GPL, I don't need to worry about that. Okay? So that's the reason why, in general, walled garden environments are for GPL. For the benevolent dictator for life sort of mentality, there are a different variety of, there's not really one particular license which is best suited towards that. That's much more of a community focus, much more than a license focus. So my point is that with a walled garden type of environment, there's a much tighter binding between licensing and the community model than there are in other models out there. So the benevolent dictator for life model, you could have, as we do with Linux, a GPL, code base, but it doesn't need to be. If you think of some of the, for example, Perl has a benevolent dictator for life, Larry Wall. But Perl has its artistic license, which is extremely permissive out there. So there really isn't a one-to-one match between that type of community model and a particular favored license.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Yeah, quick question for you, Jim.
Yes.
I'm a vendor, and I take something that's open source, add stuff to it, and make it my own proprietary stuff. Then you freeze yourself in time. The open source community goes on and improves whatever you use.
Right.
How do you resolve that as a vendor?
Okay.
That the world doesn't stand still.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the easiest way to handle that, to resolve that if you're a vendor, is be part of the community. Okay? If you are basically just someone who sees open source as a resource to be plundered, okay, as I will take that and do what I want to do with it, and then let the community do whatever it is they want to do, then it will restrict you. You will become much less nimble. Because basically what you're doing is you're looking at open source as sort of like a subcontractor that you have no control over, that you have no influence over. Okay. Now in some ways, that's true. But if you are a vendor who is involved with the open source community and have employees which are members of the open source community, then it means that you're aware of what the open source community is doing. And not so much that you have influence or able to change their direction or force their direction, but it means that you're aware of what's going on in that community. It's the communication aspect, I think, which is very, very important. Okay, if you're just seeing the open source project as, okay, they did a point release, I'm going to take that, develop it, and I'll wait 6 months to see what's going on now, then you're constantly playing catch up. But if you're involved with the community, if you're following the community, if you're part of the community, then you're able to see where the community is going, and you're able to make those changes internally so that your proprietary bits follow along your track. So when the next time for you to do a release in 6 months or whatever, you're already 90% of the way there. So it's going to be that final bit that you need to worry about.
Anyone else? We actually have a follow-on question to this because in our work to grow the community, we've been so far very successful in individuals contributing. So we've had people that we have never met and developed artifacts that are brilliant. We have people in the community posting challenges that we have never met, driving the thing forward in a positive way. What we actually intend to do with MARSA now is to drive it further with companies contributing. So it's a follow-up to what we just talked about. We find it in the maritime industry very hard to convince the key players to contribute at this point in time. Many of them are following silently what's going on. Some of them are saying, what's the cost of doing this? But so far, not really a major player has decided to become a MARSA community contributor or member. We know, for example, in other fields that as opposed to what people generally believe, that Microsoft is a very large contributor to various open source initiatives. They have paid employees that work full-time contributing to open source projects. Can you comment on how we can get around this? How do we engage these companies?
That's a really, really good point. And the unfortunate thing is that it's always difficult being the first of something. Okay, the first person who ate a crab or lobsters was probably one of the bravest individuals in the history of mankind. I mean, you can see this thing in life. I think what's sad about that is that what you're seeing is that there is a proven track record of success of people who, companies who, and technologies which have used open source, who have leveraged open source, not only just the software itself, which is important, but also the community aspect around it, the cluster aspect around it. The idea being that, we're all in this together, and especially in the maritime industry. I mean, one of the, the phrases that you hear inside of open source a lot is that a rising tide raises all boats. Okay. So you would think that companies involved in the maritime industry would realize that. They would realize that by sharing common code, this is technology which is not unique to them. This is code which doesn't differentiate them from anyone else. This is just the bread and butter foundation of having to read signals and send signals and things like that. Okay, that's not important. That's not what your company is about. That's not what your technology is about. It's about other things, other functionality. So if you're able to leverage open source and enable you to focus on the things that make you different, you're going to save money. You're also able to pull in more users and things like that. What's also very, very important nowadays is that, at least in my opinion, there is almost no, you see users of maritime devices and maritime technology wanting technology that, at least in my opinion, the maritime industry is hesitant to give them. And I think it's because they don't have the necessary resources to provide that. They're spending so much time and resources and money and energy on doing the minimal amount of stuff that even though they see the customer demand is for these features and for these enhancements, they simply don't have the resources to do it. And so if they were able to use and leverage open source, they would free up all this energy and resources to be able to now provide the sort of features and enhancements that the maritime industry has been waiting for constantly. And the first company that does that, they're going to leapfrog so much higher because now here it is. Here's a company that's providing functionality that I really, really was finally waiting for. And once that happens, it'll be sort of like a snowball effect. But the person who does that first, they will have, I think, an advantage that would take a while for others to catch up.
Thank you. Time for one last question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.